Michael Delaney sat in the corner of the living room, the soft creaking of his old armchair marking the only sound in the quiet house. The evening sun filtered through the curtains, casting warm, golden patches of light on the floor, but there was a coldness to the room that even sunlight couldn't chase away. It had been 4 years since Sarah passed. 4 years of walking around with a hollowed-out heart, functioning more out of duty than anything else. There was work to be done, bills to be paid, and, most importantly, a child to raise. Daniel was 10 now, and more like his mother every day. The way his eyes sparkled with curiosity, his quick smile, his infectious laughter that rang through the house when he played with his toys. But lately, Michael had noticed the laughter was becoming less frequent, the sparkle in Daniel's eyes dimming. And though a part of him knew why, he wasn't ready to confront it. Daniel missed her, his mother. He missed the warmth that filled their home when she was alive. Michael missed it, too. But he couldn't bring himself to talk about her. It hurt too much. Every time Daniel mentioned Sarah, Michael would nod, give a tight smile, and change the subject. He told himself that Daniel was strong enough to handle it, that he'd get through it on his own, the way Michael had to. But Michael was wrong. "Hey, Dad," Daniel's voice pulled him from his thoughts. The boy stood in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He'd just come home from school, and his face was drawn, lips pressed together as if he were holding something back. "How was school?" Michael asked, his voice clipped, distracted. He glanced at the paperwork scattered across the coffee table, invoices and unpaid bills that seemed to multiply every day. Daniel hesitated, his small frame drooping under the weight of whatever he wasn't saying. "It was fine." Michael looked up at him for a brief moment. Something in Daniel's voice made his chest tighten. But the moment passed quickly, and Michael let it go, waving a hand toward the kitchen. "There's leftover pizza if you're hungry." Daniel didn't respond. He just nodded, dropped his backpack by the door, and trudged into the kitchen. Michael watched him go, a heavy sense of guilt tugging at him. He should get up. He should follow his son, sit with him, ask him what was really going on. But the weight of the day, of the months, of the years without Sarah, held him down. Later that night, Daniel lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His room was filled with shadows, the comforting hum of the small desk fan doing little to ease the knot in his stomach. He had tried to talk to his dad today, tried to tell him about what happened at school, about how he'd gotten in trouble for not paying attention in class. But his dad didn't seem to care. Maybe he wasn't really mad at him. Maybe his dad just didn't love him anymore. Daniel rolled over, pulling the covers up to his chin. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the tears to go away. Boys weren't supposed to cry, his dad had told him once. They were supposed to be strong. But Daniel didn't feel strong. Not without his mom. The next morning came too quickly, as mornings often did. Michael shuffled through the motions of getting ready for work, Daniel quietly eating cereal at the kitchen table. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, like something was about to snap. "Don't forget your backpack," Michael said as he grabbed his keys. Daniel stared at the bowl, his spoon pushing the soggy flakes around. He didn't answer. "Daniel." He looked up, startled. Michael's voice wasn't harsh, but there was something in it, something tired and distant. "Yeah. I won't." Michael sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He didn't know what to say to him anymore. Every word felt wrong. "I'll be home late tonight. There's some extra work I have to finish at the shop," Michael said, more out of obligation than anything. He didn't expect a response. Daniel nodded, his face neutral. He didn't ask why his father worked so much, why he never seemed to want to be around anymore. He already knew the answer, or at least, he thought he did. The turning point came 2 weeks later. Daniel had been feeling off for days. It started with a mild fever, nothing serious enough to warrant concern. Michael had assumed it was just the flu, something that would pass on its own. But when Daniel collapsed at school, everything changed. Michael received the call at work, his heart sinking the moment the principal's voice came through the line. Rushing to the hospital, he was greeted by the sight of his son, pale and fragile in the hospital bed, and four hooked to his arm. The doctor's words came in fragments: serious infection, complications, life-threatening if untreated. And that was when it hit him. He had been so caught up in his own grief, in his own world, that he hadn't been there for Daniel. Not really. Not when he needed him the most. The sight of his son lying there, helpless and small, broke something in Michael. Part 2, The Hospital Vigil. Michael sat at the edge of Daniel's hospital bed, his hand resting lightly on his son's small fingers, careful not to disturb the four-line. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile room. Every beep reminded him of time that had slipped away while he was too lost in his grief to notice how much Daniel needed him. He leaned forward, staring at his son's pale face. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have been paying more attention. I should have been there for you." The words felt strange in his mouth. Apologizing wasn't something Michael was used to, least of all to his own son. But sitting there in that hospital room, watching Daniel fight for his life, he knew there were no more excuses. The doctor had told him it would be a while before they knew if Daniel would pull through. The infection had spread quickly, taking hold of his frail body, and now it was just a waiting game. Michael hated that, hated the helplessness of it all. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie. Michael looked up to see a nurse with a kind face step into the room. "You should take a break, Mr. Delaney," she said gently. "You've been here for hours." Michael shook his head, his grip tightening on Daniel's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled sympathetically and left him alone, the door clicking softly behind her. Michael exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. He couldn't leave. What if something happened? What if Daniel woke up and he wasn't there? For the first time in years, the fear of losing someone gripped him so tightly it was hard to breathe. Michael's mind wandered back to the day Sarah died. It had been sudden, a car accident on her way home from work. She had kissed him that morning, told him she'd pick Daniel up from school, and that was the last time he saw her. His heart had hardened after that. He'd built walls, shutting out the pain, shutting out everyone. But now, sitting in this room, watching his son struggle, Michael realized something: those walls hadn't protected him. They'd only isolated him, from his son, from life, from love. He stood up, unable to sit any longer, and began pacing the small room. Memories of Daniel as a baby flooded his mind, his first steps, his first words. Michael had been there for all of it. How had they drifted so far apart? How had he let himself become so distant? Daniel's recovery was slow. The fever broke after a few days, but his body was still weak, and the doctors kept him in the hospital for observation. Michael stayed by his side the entire time, refusing to leave. He slept in a chair, ate whatever the hospital cafeteria had to offer, and kept a constant vigil. It was during one of these quiet moments, when the room was dark and the only light came from the moon outside, that Daniel stirred. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused as he looked around the room. "Dad?" His voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible. Michael's heart leaped in his chest. He rushed to his son's side, gripping his hand. "Hey, buddy. I'm right here." Daniel blinked, his tired eyes locking onto his father's face. For a moment, there was silence, then Daniel spoke again, his words filled with uncertainty. "I thought you were mad at me." Michael froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Mad at you? Why would you think that?" Daniel looked away, his small shoulders sagging. "You're always busy. You never talk to me anymore." I thought maybe you didn't want to be around me." Tears welled up in Michael's eyes, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Daniel, no. That's not true. I've never been mad at you. I've been so lost since your mom." His voice broke, and he had to take a deep breath before continuing. "But none of that is your fault. I'm so sorry, son. I should have been there for you." Daniel turned back to him, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I miss her, Dad." "I know," Michael whispered, his voice trembling. "I miss her too. Every day." For the first time since Sarah's death, they sat together, openly grieving, no longer hiding behind walls of silence. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. As the days passed, Daniel grew stronger. He was eventually discharged from the hospital, though the doctors warned he would need time to fully recover. Michael took time off from work, something he hadn't done in years, to stay home and take care of his son. The first few days back at home were awkward. Neither of them knew quite how to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but they tried. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Daniel turned to his father. "Do you remember when we used to go fishing?" Michael glanced at him, surprised. It had been years since they'd gone fishing, back when Sarah was still alive. It had been one of Daniel's favorite things to do, waking up early, packing sandwiches, spending the day by the lake. "Yeah," Michael said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I remember. Can we go again? Sometime?" Daniel asked, his voice tentative, as if he was afraid of the answer. Michael hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, we can go. Whenever you're ready." Daniel smiled, the first real smile Michael had seen in a long time. It was like a weight had been lifted from both of them, as if they were finally beginning to heal. The following weekend, Michael and Daniel packed up the old fishing gear and drove to the lake. The air was cool, and the early morning mist hung low over the water. It was the same spot they used to visit with Sarah, but this time, instead of sadness, Michael felt a sense of peace. They set up their fishing rods, and for a while, there was only the sound of the water lapping at the shore and the soft buzz of insects in the air. It was a comfortable silence, one that didn't need to be filled with words. After a while, Daniel broke the quiet. "Do you think Mom would have liked this?" Michael smiled, his heart aching in a way that wasn't painful but bittersweet. "She would have loved it. She always loved being out here with us." Daniel nodded, casting his line into the water. "I think she'd be happy we're here." Michael didn't respond, but he didn't need to. He knew Daniel was right. In that moment, he felt Sarah's presence, felt her watching over them, smiling. As the sun began to rise, casting golden light over the lake, Michael looked over at his son. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. They still had a long way to go, but they were healing, together. And that was enough. In the weeks that followed their fishing trip, something shifted between Michael and Daniel. It was subtle at first, a smile exchanged over breakfast, a quiet conversation in the evenings. The silence that had once filled their home was no longer heavy with unspoken grief, it had softened, giving way to the possibility of healing. Michael made a conscious effort to be more present. He started walking Daniel to school in the mornings, something he hadn't done since Sarah passed. It wasn't much, but it was a step toward showing his son that he was there, that he cared. One morning, as they walked down the familiar path to school, Daniel tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Dad?" Michael looked down at his son, his heart warming at the sound of that single word. It had taken on new meaning since the hospital, a reminder that despite everything, Daniel still needed him. "Yeah, buddy? Can we start doing more things together? Like, not just fishing, but other stuff too?" Daniel's voice was small, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if he was asking for too much. Michael stopped walking for a moment, the question catching him off guard. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him, the hopeful expression in his eyes, the way his fingers nervously fidgeted with his backpack strap. It struck Michael how much he had missed over the years, how many moments like this he had let slip away. He knelt down, so he was eye level with Daniel. "Of course we can," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I want to do whatever makes you happy. We can do anything you want, okay?" Daniel's face lit up with a smile that made Michael's heart ache in the best way. "Really?" "Really," Michael said, nodding. "We'll start making time for the things that matter." The following Saturday, Michael took Daniel to the park, something they hadn't done in years. It was a small thing, but it felt like a monumental step. As they arrived at the playground, Daniel's eyes lit up with excitement, and for the first time in a long time, Michael saw a glimpse of the carefree boy he used to be. Daniel immediately ran toward the swings, calling out for his father to push him. Michael chuckled, jogging over to where Daniel was already sitting, his legs pumping eagerly. "Higher, Dad!" Daniel shouted, his laughter filling the air as the swing carried him higher and higher. Michael's hands gripped the chains, pushing him with gentle force, his own laughter mixing with Daniel's. As Michael watched his son, a feeling of contentment washed over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were living in the moment, no sadness, no guilt, just the simple joy of being together. Later, they sat on a bench, enjoying ice cream as the late afternoon sun dipped low in the sky. Daniel wiped a smudge of chocolate from his chin and turned to Michael, his face serious. "Do you think we'll ever stop missing Mom?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Michael's chest tightened at the question. He thought about how to answer, not wanting to give his son false hope, but also wanting to be honest. "No," he said softly, his voice steady. "We'll always miss her. But that doesn't mean we can't still be happy. She would have wanted us to be happy." Daniel nodded slowly, processing his father's words. "I think you're right," he said after a long pause. "I think she'd want us to have fun again." Michael smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Exactly. And we're going to make sure of it." For the first time since Sarah's death, Michael felt like he was starting to move forward. He would never forget her, she would always be a part of their lives, but now, for Daniel's sake and his own, he was ready to start living again. One evening, a few weeks later, Michael was tucking Daniel into bed. It had become a ritual between them, something simple, but something that reminded Daniel that his father was there for him, no matter what. As Michael pulled the covers up to Daniel's chin, he noticed something different in his son's eyes. The sadness that had once clouded them had started to lift, replaced by a quiet resilience. "Dad?" Daniel's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Yeah, buddy?" Michael sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on Daniel's shoulder. Are you happy?" Daniel asked, his small fingers twisting the corner of his blanket. The question took Michael by surprise. It wasn't something he had ever expected his son to ask, and it made him realize just how much Daniel had been watching him, picking up on his emotions, his silences. Michael thought for a moment, really considered the answer. He had spent so long in a haze of grief, drowning in his own sorrow, that he hadn't allowed himself to even think about happiness. But now, looking at his son, at the boy who had been his anchor, his reason to keep going, he realized that he was starting to find his way back. "I think I'm getting there," Michael said finally, his voice quiet but honest. "Being with you, it makes me happy." Daniel's eyes lit up, and he gave his father a small smile. "I'm glad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to be happy, Dad." Michael leaned down and kissed Daniel's forehead, his heart swelling with love for his son. "I'll make you a promise, okay?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise that I'll always try my best to be there for you. No matter what. I'm not going anywhere." Daniel nodded, his eyes closing as he snuggled deeper into the blankets. "I love you, Dad." The words were simple, but they held so much weight. Michael had heard them before, but tonight they felt different, deeper, more profound. "I love you too, Daniel," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "More than anything in the world." As he left the room, closing the door quietly behind him, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. The house, once filled with echoes of loss, was beginning to feel like home again. He knew there would still be hard days ahead, days when the grief would resurface, when the memories of Sarah would be too much to bear, but for the first time in a long time, he also knew that they would be okay. He and Daniel had each other, and that was enough. Months passed, and life slowly began to take on a new rhythm for Michael and Daniel. They found joy in small things: Sunday morning pancakes, movie nights on the couch, and impromptu trips to the park. Michael started to reconnect with friends he hadn't seen in years, and he even took up woodworking again, something he used to enjoy before everything fell apart. But the most important change was the bond between him and Daniel. It was stronger now, built on trust and understanding. They had been through the worst together, and now they were rebuilding, one day at a time. One Saturday morning, as they were cleaning out the garage, Daniel came across an old photo album. He sat down on the floor, flipping through the pages, his eyes wide with wonder as he looked at pictures of his mother, his father, and himself as a baby. "Dad, look!" Daniel exclaimed, holding up a picture of the three of them at the beach, Sarah laughing as she held baby Daniel in her arms. Michael knelt beside him, smiling at the memory. "That was one of our best trips," he said, his voice soft. "Your mom loved the beach." Daniel nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "I miss her," he said quietly, but there was no sadness in his voice this time, just love. "I do too," Michael said, wrapping his arm around Daniel's shoulders. "But she's always with us. In our hearts." Daniel looked up at his father, his eyes shining with understanding. "Yeah, she is." Michael felt a swell of pride in his chest as he looked at his son. They had come so far. Together, they had faced the darkness of their grief and emerged stronger, more connected. And now, as they stood on the brink of a new chapter in their lives, Michael knew one thing for certain: they were ready for whatever the future held. Because no matter what came their way, they would face it together.